Hello everyone, I am Rod and I am the game design instructor for the Academy of Entertainment Arts over at Dixie Hollands High School. If you are one of my students, it's Mr. Flowers to you, and welcome to this video tutorial. Good evening everyone. In this Game Maker tutorial I want to show you very quickly how to make Pong. There are a million of these out there on YouTube and I'm just going to add to the cluster that is available. But I just want to go over my way of doing it, and this is going to be a very fast video. I try to keep it within a half hour. All right, so before we start making, the code, we need to have the assets. So Pong, if you've ever played the game, it has a background, and then it has a paddle on either side and a ball that's in the middle. So let's go ahead and create our sprites. I'm going to make a new sprite here. I'll call this group assets. And in there, I'm going to make my first sprite. This is going to be the ball. So that's SPR underscore ball. I'm going to hit edit. And I'm going to make a new sprite. I think 32 by 32 is going to be fine. That's not going to be too big of a deal. Jump in here, and I'm just going to make a very quick ball. If you want this to be more precise, you're more than welcome to do it in Photoshop. I'm going to grab that, and that looks like a ball shape. It's going to be pretty even on all sides. Okay. You can make it any color you want. I'm just going to leave it as white. And I'm going to hit checkbox. And I will go ahead and center this. It'll make collision a little bit easier. Okay. The next one is going to be our paddle. So create, and that's going to be SPR underscore paddle. Hit edit. Now the size of your paddle is up to you. Now I'm going to keep mine with a width of 32, but I'm going to have the height be 128. I think that's good enough. There we go. So in here I'm just going to create the paddle. So I'm going to go all the way through. Here's my paddle. I'm going to go ahead and color this. Let's see. For player 1, I think I'm going to do green. And then I'm going to duplicate this. Hit this little copy button right here. Copy image. And then paste. And then the second one, I'll make that, let's make it blue. It's kind of a hard blue to look at. I'll make it not quite that blue. There we go. Green and blue. That works. I will center this, and then I'll hit OK. So there are our two assets. Let's go ahead and check our collision real quick. I'm going to open up the ball, modify mask. Zoom in. And a box collision really isn't all that bad, but I will hit ellipse, and it does try to give me an elliptical collision. That'll work. I'll hit OK. The paddles are going to be fine as they are because we filled the whole space. And next on the list, I need a background. So my backgrounds, I'll create a background, and I'll call this BG underscore, I don't know, background 1. What if I made multiple levels of this, Hit edit, and it's just a matter of determining the size of your background. I'm going to hit new page here. And I'm going to make this 1024 by 768. Ooh. I think I'm going to do a classic black background with Pong. And I'm just going to have some white borders. So I'm going to grab a little box here. I'll grab white. And then let's make these thicker. And then I'll have another one of these just to mark off my scoreboard. And I think I'll do a dividing line down the middle. If you want to see if you're in the center, you can actually look down at the bottom here. You can see where the mouse's position is. So this one is the X, this one is the Y. So down here, I'm at about 768-ish. And then the middle, so my screen is 1024. So the middle of that would be 512. So right dead center is 512. I'm going to create my line. There we go. There are my two sides here. And I'll hit the checkbox. I'm good. We really don't need this to tile, but it doesn't really matter, so I'm going to hit OK. Make sure I save as I go, because computers are weird. Alright, next I need to create some objects. So I'm going to create object. This will be obj_ball. And I will give it the ball sprite. And I'm going to create my room here. So create room. 1024/768. This will be RM_1 for now. I'll just give it the background like that. Here's my grid. And I will add the ball to the scene. So there's my ball. And it usually starts in the center, so I'll just put it right there. Good enough. Hit the checkbox for now. Now I have my ball object. I also need to have a game control object. So I'm going to create object. Call this obj game control. I'm going to use this to keep the score. I'm not going to give it a sprite. Keep that in there. And another object, I'm going to make just one paddle for now. So obj_paddle. And I will give it the sprite of paddle. All right, okay. All right, now that we have all of our assets created, let's go ahead and add our pieces to our game. Go ahead and open up your room. And then I'm going to go ahead and add the paddle. So first paddle. I'll line it up with the ball. I'm going to keep it a few places away from the edge of the wall here. I'm going to go ahead and set the other paddle. And while right now they're both green, we're going to change how these show up, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. The other item we need in here will be the game control object. This is going to be used for keeping track of our score and some other features like the game over and start and stop pause menu. Okay. And let's go ahead and hit that checkbox. First thing we're going to set up is the paddle. So I'm going to open this up. And we do need a create event, so I'll add an event, create. And I'll come over to control here, and I will drop in a piece of code. Whenever possible, I prefer to write code as opposed to using GameMaker's drag and drop features. So anyway, I'll call this initialize variables. Because all we're doing is initializing the variables we're going to use this object. And we're going to need a velocity y, I'm going to currently set that to 0. And we will need a move speed. I'll say move speed. And I will set that to 15. Some other variables we're going to need are the owner, so owner. In other words, which player owns this paddle. Now I'm going to give this the value of player 1. Now this is a string, so just make sure that you use the quotes there. And then I'm going to give this the final one, which is image underscore speed. And this will control the image speed. I'm going to set that to 0. If we don't do this, since we have two different images on our sprite here, it'll just flip through them rapidly at some super speed. You don't want that. So, all right, good enough. Now I just need to have my step event. So add event, step, step. Drop in a piece of code. And I'm going to go ahead and call this paddle movement. So before I go ahead and move the paddle, I want to determine which paddle is being moved. So I'm going to use a switch statement. So I'm going to say switch, and I want to check which owner is in control. So owner. And the first case is going to be player 1. I'll go ahead and add my break. And I'll do case player 2. If I could type today. I don't know what it is with this keyboard, but it likes to type extra letters. Okay. So in here, I'm going to go to player 1, and for the first player, I'm going to use the WASD keys for moving, and on player 2, I'll use the arrow keys. But we only really need to move up and down with the paddle. So I'm going to set the W key. So I'll say move paddle up, and I'll say if keyboard check. And I want to, since I'm using letters, I want to use the ORD command here, and I'm going to look for W. You got to make sure that it's capital, otherwise it won't read it. So if I press the W key, some stuff will happen. So all I want to do here is set the velocity of my paddle. So Vy will be equal to move speed. Now keep in mind which direction we're going. If we're in the y-axis and we're heading up, then we're going to want to have this to be a negative move speed because we're heading towards 0. Then I'll have a new spot. I'll have this say move paddle down. And since we have this first if here, I'm just going to use an else if statement. I'll say else if keyboard check ORD. And I'll use the S key to go down. And I'll have Vy set to a positive move speed. Finally, if I am not moving, or if I'm not pushing any of the keys, then the paddle should be idle. So I will have that say if nothing, then idle. And I'll use else, and then Vy will be 0. So what this is looking at is we have the first if, and it's checking for the keyboard press. However, the else here says else if. So if we're pushing this one has priority. If we push both of these at the same time, it'll defer to this one. However, if we're pushing this one, it'll go here. You could just do if, and if, but this is a little bit cleaner because this condition reads that if you're doing this, then this happens. Else, if you're doing this, this happens. And then the final else is if neither of these, then this happens. So it's a little bit easier to do this than to have to write if this condition, if that condition, if the next condition. So that controls our movement, but we also want to control which player is being driven here. So we do have player 1 selected, but we don't have the image being adjusted. So I'm going to make a new spot up here, and you can do this at the top or the bottom. So I'm going to make a new spot here. I'm going to say set image for player 1. And this is going to be image index, and that's going to be 0, because the first image in the sprite array is position 0. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I'm going to add that to the next line. So now we're setting images for player 2, and the next image is image 1. As far as moving up and down, the majority of the code's the same, but the key that's being pressed is going to be the arrow key. So it's VK underscore up. And then this one for moving down will be VK underscore down. Oh, don't forget the parentheses at the end. And then finally in here, we need to update our movement. So make a new spot. Now this is outside of our switch. Okay. So outside of the switch statement, we're going to have update movement. And the only piece we want to check is our y-axis. So y is going to be plus equal to, so this is going to add whatever value to y again and again, plus equal to our velocity y. So whatever our velocity is going to be, it'll be updated to y. All right? So let's see if that works. Now you can press F5 to compile and run the game. Since I have the recording app open, I can't do that because it'll shut my recording off. But if I push the button, you can see that they do move. But you can see that I am moving both paddles. And my paddles move out off of the screen. So we're going to fix that. If I push the arrow keys, nothing happens. Well, nothing happens because both paddles are being controlled by player 1. So let's go back and fix that. Inside of my game here, I'm going to go into the room. So paddle 1 we know is green. Paddle 2 should be blue. So I'm going to right click on paddle 2. I'm going to go into its creation code. And in here, I'm just going to add a little line here that says owner. And I'm going to set its owner to player 2. So now this will be rendered as player 2. So that'll solve that first problem. And then the second problem is the boundary. So let's go back into our step event here. Scroll down. And after my movement, I'm going to check my boundary. So check boundary. So once we look at our boundary, we need to know where we want to stop. If I come out of here and I open up my background piece here, okay, edit. And if you look right down here, you'll see these little numbers. This one here, this 395, that's the x coordinate, and this 666 here is the y coordinate. If I hover my mouse over here, you can see that coordinates are updating. So if this is my playing field, I know that I don't want the paddle to go outside of this boundary. So if I hover my little mouse over this white line, I find that my upper boundary is 190, and my lower boundary is about 750. Okay. So now I have my two boundary points. So I jump back into the code. Scroll back down to where it says check boundary. And I can say if y, because I want to check my y-axis, is less than or equal to my upper boundary, which is 190. And I have this set to less than or equal to because up here is heading towards 0, while down here is heading away from 0. So if I'm approaching 190, I don't want to go beyond it. So 190. But I can't just say 190. I'll show you why in just a second. Then I'm going to set my y value to 190. I'm going to do else if y is greater than or equal to my lower boundary, which is 750, then my y will be equal to 750. We can go ahead and test that. Okay, so now you're seeing that both paddles are being rendered properly, and I do have control independently of them. Let's see, as I approach the boundary, I do stop, but I'm stopping halfway across. And the reason for that has to do with the origin point of our object. So our origin is drawn central, so right in the middle here. That means that we have so many pixels above and below the origin point that we have to consider. As we approach this, we only told it that when the central point collides to stop. Well, we need to tell it however many pixels off from the origin point as well. And if you remember the size of our paddle, it's 128 long. So our origin point sits right here in the middle. That means I have 64 pixels above and 64 pixels below. So if I come in here and go back down to my boundary, and I check my y boundary plus 64, then my y boundary will be 190 plus 64. And then for my 750, as I'm getting close to the bottom, I want to make sure that it's 750 minus the 64. And then 750 minus 64. I'll go ahead and test that. And that seems to be working pretty well. We are going over just a little bit, but I'm not worried about that. And this one works as well. Okay. Now for the moment, we're pretty much done with the paddle, so we can move on to the ball. So for the ball, I'm going to open that up, and I'm going to set up a create event. And I also need to set in a piece of code. So things we need to know about the ball. So this is initialize variables. The ball has a velocity in the x. It'll have a velocity in the y. And it will have a move speed. We'll set that to 12. I'll hit the checkbox. I'm going to add an event, and I'll say step event. All right, so in here, we're going to give this a title. We're going to call this ball movement. And we're going to set this up so the ball can move, but it can only move under certain conditions. We can set up a little comment to help us think about our condition. We want the ball to move if the game has started, so we're not sitting at the start screen. If the game is not paused, and if the game is not over. So if the game has started and is not paused and is not over, has not ended, then the ball can move. So we'll set this up and we'll make an if statement. So if the game is not in the start menu, so the game has started. So if, so I'm going to use that little exclamation point for not, global dot game start. So if we're not on the start menu, and we're not on the pause menu, so global dot game paused, and the game is not over, so not global dot game over. So if we are not waiting for the game to start, we are not paused, and we are not, or the game is not over, then it's okay to update the ball's movement. So right now I'm going to go ahead and update its x and y coordinates. So x, we plus equal its velocity x, and y will be plus equal its velocity y. That's simple enough. Now let's go ahead and add these three variables to our game control object. I'm going to jump into my game controller, and this is where we're going to create those global variables. So I'm going to add an event, create, go to control, drop in a piece of code, and we'll be initializing the variables here. And we need our global dot game start. We'll set that to true. Global dot game paused. We'll set that to false. Global dot game over. We'll set that to false. And there are a few more variables in here that I'll make while I'm here. We'll also need our global dot player 1 score. We'll need our global player 2 score. And we'll also need the maximum score that the game can reach. So global dot max score. And for now, I'll just set that to 2. But you can change this. You can actually have an option to where it can be 2 points, 3 points, 7 points, or whatever. It's up to you. I have the checkbox. Now I'll add a step event. In my step event, I'm going to call this update game. And I'm going to set up a condition for whenever I push a button. So if keyboard check, but I only want this button to be checked whenever I push it once. So keyboard check pressed is the command I'm going to use. And I'm going to be looking for this space bar. So VK underscore space. So if I hit the space bar, some stuff is going to happen. I'm going to say if game has not started. So if the game has not started, that means we're on the start menu. So we'll say if global dot game start. So if this is set to true, then we want to start the game. So start game. So global dot game start. We'll set that to false. So it'll turn this flag off. And then we want to move the ball. So set ball movement. So we'll have object ball dot velocity x. And I'm going to have that set to a random direction. So choose obj underscore ball dot move speed, comma. So it can be a positive move speed or a negative move speed. So negative obj underscore ball dot move and the same thing for the y. So obj underscore ball dot vy. Choose and then obj underscore ball dot move speed, and then of course choosing to see if it's going to be a negative move speed. So that way we have a random start. It can go up or down or whichever. So that'll start the game. But we also want the ability to pause the game. So I'm going to make a new spot here. I'm going to say if game has started and is not paused. So I'm going to use an else if here. I'm going to say else if. So if we are not on the start menu, so not global dot start, and if we're not paused, so global dot game paused. So if we're not currently on the start menu and we are currently not paused, then the game will run. Else we will set the game paused flag to true. So we'll set this, we'll say pause game. And then if we hit the button again, let's say the game is paused, then the final condition would be else if game is paused, then unpause the game. So else global dot game paused will then be false. So that'll work. Hit the checkbox. Go ahead and run it. Alright, so I have them paddle. Both paddles work. If I hit the start button, ball goes. And I can pause it. Now the ball does not bounce, so it's not really playable just yet. So let's set up a condition that allows the ball to bounce. I'm going to go ahead and hit this little cancel button. I'm going to open up the ball again. And in here I want to set up some collision events so that the ball can bounce. First thing I'll do is set up a spot that says check boundary. So my boundary of my ball is going to be the upper and lower ends of my screen. If you look at the game, let's go to my backgrounds here. If we look at this, you can see that our playing area is divided off by this little white line, and our scoring area is up here. So we don't want the ball to bounce up in this area. So our upper boundary is going to be here, and our lower boundary is going to be this white line here. We can figure out what these are by going into the little edit menu. And in here, go ahead and zoom out. You can see my little cursor, my little pencil. Down at the bottom, there are some numbers in the parentheses. The first number is the x coordinate of my pointer. The second box, or second set of numbers, is my y coordinate for this. So if I take this and I hover it, let me get something that's a little bit easier to look at. Let me grab this little selector here. If I put this, the middle of this cross on this white line, you can see down at the bottom, the height, or the second number there, is 191. So the height of my bar is 190 pixels, give or take. And the bottom of my area is about 750 pixels. So I know my upper bound is about 190 and my lower bound is about 175. I can use that to my advantage. So I hit the checkbox here. Inside the ball, I'm going to make a little statement that says, if the y value of the ball is less than or equal to 190, then velocity y is going to be multiplied by a -1. Else, if my y is greater than or equal to 750, then my velocity y is going to be multiplied by a -1. So all this is going to do is flip the ball whenever it reaches the upper or lower boundary. We can go ahead and test that. If I hit the play button, so if I hit the go button, bink, the ball bounces. Now I still can't hit it with the paddle. So let's go ahead and take care of that. I'm going to open up my ball movement. And under here, I'm going to set up a condition that allows me to bounce it back. So I'm going to say, check collision with paddle. So all I'm going to do here is say if place underscore meeting, that's the game maker's collision, the x and y of the ball is going to collide with obj underscore paddle, two parentheses there. So if we hit the paddle, all right, then in here we're just going to go ahead and set up some basic collision. In the event that the ball comes in contact with the paddle, we're just going to flip the x and y values. So we're going to have the velocity x will be multiplied by a -1, and the velocity y will be multiplied by a -1. Now this will get you some very basic collision. So you can play the game from here. So go ahead and run this. As you can see, it's not the most accurate collision. It has some weird features, but it is good enough to play. So let's go ahead and set up our score. So jump out of here. Now so let's jump inside of our game controller. And in here, we're going to go down and create a new event. We're going to call this a draw event. So draw, draw. And then the control tab, we're going to drop in a piece of code. We're going to have this called draw score. For this, we need to set a color. So set draw color. You can pick whatever color you want, but I'm going to use the draw set color function. Now I'm going to choose C_white. You could do red or green or whatever, but I'm going to pick white. And now I'm going to draw the score for each player. So draw score for player 1. And that's going to be draw_text. And I'm going to use the text transformed feature. Transformed. And for the x and y value, this is going to be dependent on the actual game window. So I'm going to jump into my room here. And I want this to be drawn up here in this area. So to figure out where to draw, we can actually look down here for our x and y. If I hover my mouse over a certain spot, you can see that I get an x and y readout. To be more precise, I'm going to turn that grid back on. And I want my score to appear right here. So at the corner of this box, that looks like it is 416 and 128. And then I want the other one to appear over here at the corner of this box, which would be 608 and 128. So I say 416 and 608. So let's jump back in. So my x coordinate was 416. The y coordinate was 128. The message going to draw to the screen will just be string, and then the actual score feature. So global dot player 1 underscore score. Next, I need the size. The x scale, I'm going to do 3, and then 3, and then 0 for the rotation, or 0 for the angle. And that should be player 1 score. And then I'm going to do the next. I'm just going to copy this for player 2. So player 2 score, and it was 608. I'll change this to player 2. Let's go ahead and run it and see what it looks like. All right. So this 0 kind of popped off a little bit too far. So I'm going to push it back some. Let's see. So that corner was 416. Let's try 576. All right, that looks a little bit better. I could probably push it over just a little bit more, but good enough for me. Now let's actually add some score features. So hit OK. I'm going to open up the ball again. We're going to capture the score inside the ball. All right, so I'm just going to put the score after the boundary. And the reason I'm putting it here instead of at the end is it just makes more sense. It's because our score is based on the boundary of our level. So the boundary up top and bottom, it bounces, but the boundary left and right creates a score. So this is just an add-on from our boundary check. So I'm going to say check if player scored. And to find that out, I'm going to look at the left and right. So if the x of the ball is less than or equal to 0, so that's this left corner. I'm going to give that an extra set of parentheses here. Or x is greater than or equal to my rightmost boundary. And if we remember when we set up our room, our rightmost boundary is 1024. So 1024. So if we are less than the 0 bound or greater than or equal to the right bound, then the player has scored. And inside here, we're going to check if we actually scored. Now we do need to tell which player scored what. So I'm going to have another check in here. So which player scored. So if the ball actually hits the right side, or if the ball hits the left side, then player 2 scores. If the ball hits the right side, then player 1 scores. So I'm just going to say if x is greater than or equal to 1024, then global dot player 1 score is going to increase by 1. So plus equals 1. Else, which means if the other condition, then global dot player 2 underscore score is going to increase by 1. Now you could set this up in 2 if statements, and one if statement checks for this, the other if statement checks for the other, instead of doing it the way that I am here. The only reason I'm doing this double check is to kind of shorten the rest of the code. I want all of this to sort of do the same thing, and then I want to write the code 6 times. So this is just going to shorten it a little bit for me. But let's go ahead and test that. So I hit OK, and I'll play it. So I've hit the button, and it goes out of bounds. Some scoring is happening. Now it's staying out of bounds, so it's going to keep on counting. So we'll end up closing that. Jump back in. So once we score, 2 things should happen. One, the round should stop and wait for the next round to begin. And the other condition is if there's a winner, the game should end. So we'll set that up here. If a score happens, then start next round. Or if there is a winner, reset the game. Okay. So our first if statement is actually going to check this last condition, which is whether or not there's a winner. So we're going to say if global dot player 1 score is greater than or equal to global dot max score. I'm going to encapsulate that into its own set of parentheses. Or global dot player 2 score is greater than or equal to global dot max score. So if this is the case, then global dot game over is true. Else global dot game start is true. So what this checks for is if there is a winner, then it's going to go to game over, and we'll set the decided winner inside the game controller. However, if there is no winner, then we're just going to start a new round. So with the game start set to true, it'll freeze the ball. We just have to put the ball back in the starting position. And if we look inside the game, our ball starts at 512, 448. So let's go ahead and set that. So inside here, we have a spot where we say reset ball position. The X is going to be 512. The Y is going to be 448. Let's go ahead and give this a quick save, and let's test it. All right, so if the ball goes out, boom, and player 2 has scored. If I bounce it back, boom, player 1 has scored. And my max score, I think, is set to 2. So if somebody else scores, that should be the end of the game, and then we would reset. But we don't have a way to reset, so it's just going to stay here. All right. So let's go back into our game control, and let's set up the condition for actually winning, so it draws the text when we win, and so that it shows us if the game's paused or not. So I'm going to go my draw event here. I'm going to add a new piece of code, go to Control, new piece of code. I'm going to call this draw messages. So this is going to display all the messages that we're going to use in our game. So first part I need a message color. So set text color. Let's go ahead and expand this. So same things we did before. We're going to do draw set color. Now you don't have to call this every time. The reason that I am is in the event that you made it something else somewhere else, this will make sure that it's whatever color you want. So I'm just going to call it one more time. I'm going to pick a color. I'm going to say white, but you could pick blue or red. So like if there's a winner, you could have it display the text as a different color. And then I'm going to also want to center my text on the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and say center text, and that's draw set horizontal alignment, so H-A-L-I-G-N. And we're going to use the command FA center. So that'll ensure that our text is centered horizontally on our screen. Next, I want to set my font size. So I'm going to make a little spot here. I'm going to say font size. And I'm just going to say size, or you can do F size, whatever you want. And that's going to be 3. And next I want to set up the display for whenever we start a new game. So if starting a new game or round, so I'm going to say if global dot game start. So if the game start is set to true, we're going to say draw text transformed. And then for my X value, I'm going to put this in the middle of the screen. So it's going to be where the ball is, so 512 over. Now we do have this set to center, but what this does is it centers it on the X and Y value. So if we didn't tell it to center, it would draw the text from the center over. But since we have it set to center here, it's going to draw the text evenly across the middle. So 512 is going to be the X value, and then 448 is the other value. Now these are based on my screen. My screen is 1024 by 768. If your screen size or your game window size is different, then your centers will be different. Then it's going to have this say start game, comma, and then my font size. So F underscore size, comma, F underscore size. If you had different font sizes, you could do font size X and Y. My font's going to be the same size, both X and Y. And then 0 for the angle, and I'll hit the semicolon. So that's if we're starting a new round. Now let's make a spot. Let's go ahead and copy that. And this will be if the game is paused. So if game is paused, I'll change this value to game paused. So if the game is paused, then I will display a message for paused. So I'll just say paused. Okay. The next area is going to be for determining the winner. So we'll say if game is over, so if global dot game, game over. So if game over, then we're going to do some stuff. So in here, I'm just going to go ahead and paste our little message. And this is going to determine if there's a winner. So we're going to say if player, actually we're going to say who won. So we'll write a little message. We're going to say if global dot player 1 score. And you can do this in two ways. You can check if each player's score is greater than the others, because if the game's over, if player 1's score is greater than player 2's score, then he wins. Or you could check if player 1 is equal to max score or player 2 is equal to max score. But the first of those conditions is actually the cheapest one to run. So if player score is greater than global dot player 2 score, then we're going to display a message. So inside of here, I'm going to do some stuff. Now I'm going to be fancy. I'm going to have a new spot to change the text color. So we'll say draw underscore set color. And player 1 was set to green, so we'll do C underscore green for my paddle color. And then right here, I'm going to say player 1 wins. Maybe put like a little exclamation point there. Player 1 wins. Yay. To get the other condition, I'm just going to say else. Because of these two possibilities, there's only two, right? The player 1 could be greater, or in this case, else player 2 could be greater. And it's just going to be this. So I'll realign that. So instead of being green, player 2 was set to blue, and I'll just change this 1 to 2. And now we should be able to win. So let's go ahead and see if we can get a winner. Okay? So let's see. 1, 2. Player 2 wins. There we go. Player 2 wins. Awesome. But we can't yet restart the game. We should also probably hide the ball if we win. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to close this off inside the ball. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to affect the ball's draw event. So I'm going to add an event, draw, draw. In here, I'm going to put a piece of code in, and I'm going to say hide ball if game is over. So we'll say if not global dot game over. So if the game is not over, then we can say draw self. Otherwise, if the game ends, it will not draw the ball. And we can test that real quick. Okay. 1, 2, and we win. Yay! And the ball is not showing up. Game's over. Okay. But now we want to reset the game so that we can start over and play again. So I'm going to go into the step event. I'm going to go to update game. Open this all the way up. And we have a condition here that says if we hit a keyboard or if we press a key, we start the game. And then inside here we have if the game is not started, then we can start the game. However, if the game is paused, then we'll pause the game, and vice versa. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to encapsulate this inside of a condition that checks if the game is over. So if not game global dot game over. So if the game is not over, then all of this stuff can happen. So I'll select this all, I'll tab it over, and I'll put a closing brace here. So if the game is not over, then all this can happen. Else, we're going to reset the game. So else, we're going to say reset the game. Oops. So the global dot game over will be false, because if we reset the game's no longer over. The global dot game start would be set to true, because we would be back to the start menu. And then we want to reset the score. So reset player scores. So global dot player 1 score will be 0, and global dot player 2 score will be 0. Okay, go ahead and do a quick save, and now we can test this and see if it works. So I'll play the game and I'll bounce the ball back. 1, 2, we can score, we can win, and hit the button, start game. 1, player 1 wins, start game. 1, oops. Player 2 wins. Yay, and we can do this perpetually. Awesome. Go ahead and close that. So now what I want to do is make the game feel a little bit more like a game. I'm just going to improve on the ball physics. So I'm going to hit this. I'm going to open up the ball. And inside of here, I'm going to go down to where it says collide with the paddle. And instead of just reversing the ball, we're going to set up a condition that checks for whether or not the paddle is moving and what direction it's moving in. So I'm going to go ahead and nuke these two pieces. I'm going to say if paddle is idle, so if the paddle's not moving, so if obj underscore paddle dot velocity y, because our paddle only moves up and down, is 0, then the velocity of our paddle, so Vx, is going to flip. So we're only going to change the x value of our paddle. And the reason we're only changing the x value is if you think of Newton's law of physics, if an object is moving toward the left, it's going to continue to go toward the left until it hits something that makes it go the other way. So let's say I'm falling to the left to the floor, so diagonally left, and I hit the floor. Well, what do? I don't bounce this way, I bounce this way. I still head left, I just head left like in the upper corner. If I'm heading up to the left and I'm going to head down to the left. So the only thing that changes is one of my forward directions, but not the primary direction I'm moving in. So that's what's happening here. I'm just changing my horizontal value. So if I'm heading toward the paddle at this angle I will bounce this way. If I'm heading toward the paddle at this angle, I will hit and bounce this way. And that will work. And we can test it if you like. So let's jump in. So if I leave the paddle idle, the ball will bounce. And we can kind of continue to bounce in this circle. Now there is no collision for when the ball is when the paddle is moving. We have to set that up. So let's jump back into our code. And we'll check to see if the paddle is moving in what direction. Go ahead and move this up so you can see. I'm just going to say if paddle and ball are moving in the same direction. So if the paddle is moving up at the same time the ball is moving up, then the only value that's going to flip will be the x value, but the y value will increase. It'll gain some speed. So if, I'm going to add an extra parenthesis here, obj underscore paddle dot velocity y, because that's the direction or the only axis our paddle can move in, is less than 0, which means it's heading up. And, open parenthesis, our velocity y of the ball is less than 0. Then we're going to do some stuff. Or, so there's double bars there, we're going to say obj underscore paddle dot velocity y is moving down, so greater than 0. And our ball, velocity y, is greater than 0. We're going to do some stuff. So inside of here, we'll put some code. So we'll just check our condition. So if they're both moving up or they're both moving down, we're going to flip the x, and then we're going to add some speed to the y. So velocity x is going to be multiplied by a -1. I need a new keyboard. My velocity y is going to be equal to the current velocity y plus the paddle's velocity y divided by 2. Now the only reason why I'm dividing this by 2 is I don't want the paddle to get too fast, although physics would suggest that depending on the materials, if it's a hard material and the ball was rubber or acrylic or whatever it is, the ball would probably retain or gain about 90% of whatever the force was, and yada yada yada. I'm not going to that level of detail. I just want some force to be absorbed, and I don't want to go too crazy. But this should be enough. So if we're going in the negative direction, so two negative values, so negative plus a negative is a bigger negative. And if they're both going into a positive value, two positive values get a bigger positive. Simple enough. And then my final condition is going to be if they are moving in opposite directions. So my third and final condition is if they're moving in opposite directions. So if paddle is moving up while ball is moving down. So if obj underscore paddle dot velocity y is moving up, so less than 0, and the velocity y of the ball is going in the opposite direction. So if the paddle is going up and the ball is going down, you're going to have some opposite forces there. So in this case, we're going to do or obj underscore paddle dot velocity y is greater than 0, and the velocity y of the ball is less than 0. So the paddle is going down in this case, and the ball is going up in this case. Then we're going to do some stuff. The Vx of the ball, the velocity x of the ball will still flip. So that's going to be multiplied by -1. And then for the y, we're going to do Vy, and we're just going to flip the y. So -1. Now what would really happen is if it hit the opposite force, you would lose some of that and you'd have to take the remainder. I'm not going to go that complicated into the math, but this should give us a pretty playable game. The only thing you might want to compensate for is preventing the ball from actually passing into the paddle. And to do that, you could just you could separate these two statements. You could have one that only checks for left and right and one that checks for up and down. But right now it's just encapsulated into one particular function. You could also check where the ball is going to be versus where it is, and that can help you a little bit there as well. Again, I'm not going to go too complicated into this. This is just a very simple Pong. And we will test this one final time, make sure everything's going to run. And we should be able to play at the very least. So there's that one. Bam. A little bit of a glitch there. But we can change the direction of the ball by changing how the paddle hits it. That one's down. That should be there. Dink. And we can pause the game. Some basic physics works. And alright, so that's a very simple way of making Pong. I hope you've had a little bit of fun while putting this together and make some tweaks, do some things with it, see what you can come up with. And thank you for watching.